Hi, I'm Brendan Bussey, and I'm going to be talking about the Rocky Flats nuclear arsenal. And this tells the story of a post-war wasteland that was restored to a national wildlife refuge. So more specifically, this case looks at the cleanup and repurposing of a former nuclear arsenal facility. This was really important in the post-World War II buildup of nuclear weapons and the Cold War era. The facility is located just outside of Denver, Colorado, and leaves behind a long nuclear legacy that local residents continue to try to live with, including its conversion by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to a national wildlife refuge. So the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, also known as the Service, identified this mission for the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, describing it as a healthy expanse of grasslands, shrublands, and wetlands. It also has this rare xeric tallgrass prairie located in the area. The refuge also has views of the mountain and prairie and high compatibility in an urbanized area for wildlife-dependent public use and education. So the lead agency on this project is the U.S. Department of Energy, and then our prominent cooperating agencies are the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. So what's special about this project is that it's governed by the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997. And this act directs all national wildlife refuges to complete a CCP, which is a comprehensive conservation plan. And this is used to plan management strategies that last 15 years after the area is designated as a national wildlife refuge. So some of the main goals that were identified by the service are wildlife and habitat management, public use, education and interpretation, effective and open communication, working with others, and refuge operations. So our alternative A is our no action alternative, and this would basically leave Rocky Flats as is. There wouldn't be much management, restoration, or education anywhere here. So our alternative B, which is our preferred alternative, kind of combines a lot of these goals that were identified by the service. So this plan emphasizes wildlife and habitat conservation along with wildlife dependent public use. So within this, we'd see like a lot of native plant communities and animal species like wildlife populations being managed and protected, like the Prevost meadow jumping mouse, which is an endangered species. So we would also see visitor use facilities be constructed, like trails and parking and overlooks, as well as education programs, a small hunting program, and some research opportunities. So our alternative C is more focused on ecological restoration. This emphasizes more the restoration of habitat and managing plant and wildlife species. There wouldn't really be any of this public use facilities being developed or many trails or parking. And then alternative D is kind of the opposite, where this is more focused on wildlife dependent public use. So we would see some restoration of plant and wildlife species, but more broadly, we would see this development of public use facilities like long trail systems and a lot of parking, overlooks, a lot more education programs, and of course some research. So for our practitioner qualifications, we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as our lead agency here. And our point person on this whole project is Lori Shannon, and she is the team leader of the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. And her partner here is Michael Spratt, and he is the Chief of Refuge Planning in Region 6. And they both report to Dean Rundle, who is the refuge manager, and he plays more of an administrative role in the process. So as you can see throughout the Fish and Wildlife Service, we see a lot of different specialties here, mostly in STEM and natural sciences, but we also see a lot of experience as well. Like Lori Shannon, she doesn't have her master's or PhD like some of her colleagues here, but she is the second most experienced person here. So she has her qualifications from her experience more than her education. And then looking below that, we have the Shapens Associates, and this company was contracted on to be the project manager for several projects dealing more with city and regional planning and architecture. So these associates came with master's degrees. They have a lot of experience in their field and really felt like they know what they were doing. And then we have Resolve, which was contracted on to be more of a facilitator and deal with more of the human relations side of the projects and getting more involved with people. Then finally, we have the ERO Resources Corporation, and this company was contracted on to do a bulk of the project management. So similar to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, ERO has more of a variety of experts in their company. But we see a lot of focus still on STEM, like engineering and natural sciences. And in 2007, when this land was established as a national wildlife refuge, more of this open space that could be used, and they went out and studied the species. A lot of these threatened and endangered species were identified, as well as the xeric tallgrass prairie plant communities, which were very rare. And another interesting thing about how the service conducted their data collection is they used thresholds to measure impacts on each of the variables studied. So then these variables, the impacts on these variables would be identified as being negligible, minor, moderate, or major. Because the Rocky Flats nuclear arsenal project was more of a one-of-a-kind project, it couldn't really be largely compared to another project. There aren't many nuclear facilities that were transitioned to a national wildlife system. So instead, the service kind of relied on these smaller little comparative analyses. One that was really interesting was a risk-based calculation that was done on an individual consuming 5 pounds of liver or 62 pounds of muscle from a deer on the refuge. And it was found in some of these deer tissue that they were containing radioactivity at levels that if were consumed throughout an individual's lifetime on a regular basis, there would be a 1 in 210,000 increase in probability of cancer. But this still meets the US EPA's acceptable risk range, which was a little concerning to me. And then another interesting study that they did looked at soil levels of radioactivity, and it was found that the soil here had 1.09 picocuries per gram of radioactivity with an average of 3.2 in downwind areas. So the government allows 9.8 picocuries per gram, which was kind of concerning to me as well, considering that this radioactivity could still be harmful no matter what amount. So the public participation and involvement processes were managed under the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act. So this process was governed by provisions in NEPA and within the CCP that was created. So a total of 7 planning updates were publicly published from 2002 to 2004, and these had updates like workshops, public meetings, and public hearings. And the service also developed a website that would post information on the project, meetings, comments, documents, media releases, and advertisements. And what was also interesting was the service kind of had a commitment to target the more powerful community members in the area so that information could be more effectively distributed throughout the community. Cultural and social resources were identified based on their presence and estimate of possible disturbance. So impacts that were relevant to certain locations were not determined until the final design and layout were finished before surface disturbance was accounted for. So as a result of this, no resources were eligible as listing for cultural and social resources. There were 15,000 homeowners that were downwind of the refuge that filed a $375 million lawsuit concerning the radioactivity I mentioned earlier. And so it took a judge 26 years to approve this before Rockwell International and Dow Chemical were forced to pay for property damages. When 3,000 individuals signed a petition to remove prescribed burns from the service's plan due to concerns of this radioactivity being released back into the environment. The refuge did not meet the criteria to be designated as a wilderness system because of its significant impacts of human activity in the past. Our alternative B, the service discussed nutrient cycling as a mitigation strategy to the soil erosion caused by a lot of these habitat expansions and from digging up roads and managing native species, there was a lot of soil erosion identified. So the service kind of identified nutrient cycling as a simple fix. The service kind of responded with this removal of roads and soil disturbances are all going to be very short-term disturbances, but the long-term benefits from revegetation and managing all of these species and ecosystems serves as the mitigation. Because the CCP lasts for 15 years, we are only about halfway through our management here. So the CCP requires the continued management, evaluation, and research of this facility, which I think is beneficial and will be helpful to management. So in addition to this, the refuge is still in the process. So they're now preparing to conduct more social research by using surveys. I would have to give this project an overall grade of a B+. There was a vast amount of primary data that was collected through the service, which I think for this specific case is beneficial and was needed. So it was very useful that they did that due to the circumstances. And I also felt that the CCP requirements create higher standards for SIA because we're not only following regulations by NEPA, but we're also following these other guidelines from the National Wildlife Refuge Systems. There were several shortcomings in responding to certain public concerns, but in the long run, a lot of these were addressed and are still continuing to be addressed, and the public did a really great job of defending themselves here